Welcome back, everybody, to Gear Gods Presents Studio Pass with Kurt Ballou here on Creative Live. We're excited to get into this final second half of the day, but before we do, we would love to take some questions, actually, at this point from our last segment. We do have a bunch of the questions that you guys asked, so I'm just going to jump right in. How do you feel about that?
I feel great. I just had a healthy, nutritious lunch. I'm feeling energized, and I hope everybody else is, and I am ready for questions.
Fantastic. All right, well, I'm going to throw one at you here from Study. With two Ds, Study, who says, I always take clean, no-bleed samples of the drum kit at the start of tracking. Why not use the samples to replace the bad bleed-covered tracks? For example, take 10 or more samples of clean tom hits and replace the close mics with the clean samples. What do you think about this approach?
Yes, I have absolutely done this, and there are arguments for and against that, and the arguments for that is that it's a more organic tone and related to the drum set, and not, not some sort of prepackaged, canned sort of tone. The arguments against that, or actually, I'll just word of caution: make sure that if you're doing that, you're taking samples. Make sure the drummer gives you a really wide dynamic range of hits to choose from. Typically, when a drummer is recording samples, they are playing harder than they are in the context of the song. So make sure you have a wide range of things to choose from if you need to replace those. And also not all dead center hits, some off center hits, because especially with toms, people tend to have a pretty wide wear pattern on the drum because they're not as accurate on toms as they tend to be on the snare. And I'll also take that even one step further and say that if you choose to take samples of the bass drum, make sure that those samples include both hits that are with the beater resting against the head after it's struck and with the beater bouncing off the head after it's struck. When you're resting the beater, you tend to have a much shorter decay than when you bounce the beater. So like instances of double bass playing or any sort of super fast bass drumming, they're not resting the beater on the head as they're going because they're constantly pulling it off. But in slower bass drumming, they tend to rest the beater on the head. So make sure you have both versions of those samples. If you choose to replace any bass drums that, when you're doing double bass stuff, you're pulling the resonant sounds. If you want it to feel realistic, and when you're doing single bass, you're doing the more dead type of sounds. The reason not to do that, aside from just the pain in the ass that is replacing drum hits, is especially toms, which tend to be very dynamic, and it's hard to really mimic those dynamics with samples. The other reason not to do it is there will actually be a phase relationship between the original tom track and your new tom track, since it's the same tone. So you really have to be very careful about lining up your transients exactly when doing it that way, so that the transient of the sample is in the exact same location as the transient of the original hit. If you don't do that, then your phase relationship between your sample and your overhead might wander from hit to hit. So you just have to be a little careful with that. And for that reason, I actually find that when and I don't do it often, but when I do bring samples into a setup, I'll use samples from some other session or from some sample pre-pack or something like that, because I know that those samples will have I don't want to say no phase relationship, but the phase relationship is much less important when using a sample from another recording session. That being said, it's great to have samples of your drum set as a safety, and I do it all the time because sometimes you might have a bad hit here or there. You might want to just replace one bad hit, or maybe there's like a riff with a bunch of bad hits. If common problem is a drummer who plays too high on their snare drum when they're playing a hi-hat beat, you might want to replace all the snares for just the hi-hat beat, but you might not want to have to replace the snare for the entire song. So then if you have samples, you can replace just in the area that you need without it affecting the rest of the track. And same thing with double bass, actually. One technique that some drummers use when recording double bass is if they know that they can't play a super fast double bass pattern as accurately as they want to, when that double bass pattern comes up, they'll just stop playing with their feet entirely and just do hands only. and then it'll be up to you as an engineer to create a kick track for that section. And if you have samples of the actual drum set, you can drop those in to only that section that requires it without having to lose the natural feel from the rest of the song. Yeah, that's I guess that's about it for that
So
one.
when you're actually dropping the samples in, do you do that manually? Do you do it with like DRT and trigger like a lot of people do, or?
Well, if I'm dropping them in manually, then I use a bunch of things. Like actually, we can just do a little example. When I was doing the tom editing, I'll just kind of drop into. Well, you know what? I'll do it on a snare track. Let me grow this snare. What do I do? How do I use Pro Tools? Track height, large. Okay, so let's just say, for example, that I want to replace every snare hit with a tom, or that I'll just use a tom as an example. So let me make another track here. And then I'll assign the output of that track to my raw tracks and look at that a little bigger. And I'm just going to kind of skip over these flams for now because you might handle those a little differently. But just there's a few backbeats here of snare. I'll just do the same thing that I did when I was editing toms, where I have my keyboard shortcuts turned on, tab to transient is turned on, and I'm just tabbing over to the beginning of the transient of each snare hit. Okay, then actually I'm going to put this track up above that. Okay, and then I'm just going to say, I've already edited these tom things, so I'm just going to pretend that this is a snare sample that I recorded after the session. I just copied this rack tom, pasted it up there, and let's actually make this a little bit bigger. It's actually going to be easier to edit to move around a larger segment. So. I'm grabbing the rack track and I'm going to hit Alt-Shift-3, which is a shortcut for consolidate region. So now I have this sample up here, which is a tom track, but let's pretend it's a snare, and I want to align it with this region. So I'm going to click on this region and then Control click, and it will snap the beginning of my tom sample region to the same position as that, okay? And then now I have one of two ways that I can also apply this to all the other regions. Let me actually make a few more regions. I'm kind of just going to pretend this snare is not a flam and not worry about how we handle that. So we have a few to deal with here. I can now either, I think it's Control Option, click on this, and it will snap a copy of this region lined up with that. The other thing I can do is, I'm just going to remove that for now and sort of bring this back out to its original size. Okay, the other way that I can do this, if I have a lot of these to do that's a little faster, is, it's been a while since I've done this, so bear with me if I mess up. I'm going to grab that, I'm going to copy. So in Pro Tools I can just press C to copy, but I can also do it as an edit copy. Or maybe it's Apple C. I think it's just C. Okay, so I'm going to copy, and then I'm going to turn off tab to transient. So now when tab to transient is turned off, as I tab, it will not follow the transients, but it will just tab to the beginning of the next region. Okay, so I'm going to tab to transient, and then I'm going to shift click my, my triggered track. And now when I tab over to the next one, it's tabbing over on both my original snare track and my triggered track. Then I can press V, and it will paste the copied snare trigger onto the new track. And now at this point, I can just keep doing tab V, tab V, tab V, tab V, all the way to the end of the song if I'm replacing every hit. Or if it's just a section where I'm replacing every hit, I can just keep doing tab V, tab V, tab V. If you want to have any variance in the tones, like if you want to have like left hits and right hits, like you got to do that a little bit more manually. But if there's just like a segment where you want a bunch of identical hits, like in the case of a double bass section, you might want to do this. Or double bass sections, more than likely you're, doing some kind of super perfect recording technique and you're on a grid and you can just say like, oh, eighth notes grid and just make it all happen. But this is one way to, without any kind of triggering plug-in application, to just manually place a bunch of samples that goes relatively quickly.
Great.
I'm just going to delete this track so that it doesn't screw me up in the future.
That's probably smart. While you're doing that, do you plan to cover automation at all? We've got a question or two about that.
Sure. I mean, there's a lot of kinds of automation specific to drums.
Dude Bro, good name.
Yeah,
Dude Bro. Was wondering whether you ever use volume automation to achieve a similar result for tom gating.
Oh yeah, I used to do it with. I didn't used to edit the toms. I used to do that all with volume automation. It's certainly a viable way to do it. You don't have the benefit of that rolling around crossover thing where the decay is a warmer tone than the attack when you do it with volume automation. The other reason not to do volume automation, aside from it being more time consuming, you don't have like the tab to transient automation so much, or the tab to transient option in writing volume automation quite as easily. But as you start to stack up things in Pro Tools and add things that consume system resources, the automation tabs actually become less accurate, and there can be a bit of a time lag in the volume automation. They may have fixed that in Pro Tools 11, but I know that I'm running 10 and I see subtle lags in time. So when I'm doing automation to guitars, for example, I have to sort of anticipate it sometimes. And when I am writing automation, I tend to treat it more like I'm doing a fader. So there's it's slower movements rather than just instantaneous up and downs. So I've had better luck doing it with editing, but if volume automation works for you, that's great. Just another thing about automation before I forget, I mentioned earlier about automating the SPL transient designer on drums once in a while. If you have a passage where it's too technical for the drummer to strike as hard as you want to hear it struck, I might turn transient designer on for that stuff. The other thing that I like to do is automate my overhead volume in relation to my room mic volume, depending on the tempo of the song. So slower songs might get a little bit more room mic, and faster songs might favor the overhead a little bit. And then also with regards to reverb time on the drums, or really the whole mix, faster songs might have a shorter reverb time, and slower songs might have longer reverb times.
Great, and I think we've got time for one more if the answer's quick. From Slow Eye, do you experiment with the curves of the fades when doing the tom editing? Do you find that any particular curve seems to impart a more natural decay?
Yes, for sure, and that's something that is up to you in the song. But yeah, I tend to go with just whatever the default is. But an S curve can be nice, or all the different shapes, and the lengths of them can vary a lot. It's all sort of something you just got to determine on the fly. If you were listening to toms in solo, I think that would be a lot more important than if you had overheads and room mics and stuff factoring in. I think that the editing that I'm doing is actually, because a drum set is, there's a lot of inherent bleed within all the microphones of the drum set, that kind of makes that tom editing a lot more forgiving, and you can be tolerant of a super fast fade here or a super slow fade there if the circumstances dictate it.
Great, and I think with that, it's time to move into our next subject.
All right, what is our next subject?
Next subject, I believe, is mix prep for everything else, looks like.
Yeah, where are we here? Mix prep continued. Here's our next subject. Okay, so can we get the slides up on the big screen now? I want to do a little phase alignment of the guitars and the bass, similar to what we did with the two kick mics and the two snare mics and the two tom mics, or the bottom and top tom mics. Do the same sort of principle with guitar and bass to make sure that those have maximum impact and feel like they're coming from a single source. So as I mentioned when we were tracking guitars, if you have any concerns about your ability to hear these phase discrepancies, or if you're feeling really lost about what is the correct thing, because it's not always going to be super obvious what's the best phase position or phase alignment of two sources, just go with one mic. There's a lot you can do with one mic by EQing it, or if you can break one mic out into multiple tracks. Like if I'm mixing a session that was recorded with a single bass mic as opposed to the double system that I usually have, I might mult that bass track so that I have, and then put EQs on that bass track so that I have independent control of the highs and lows. And that is a way, as long as your delay compensation is turned on your DAW, that's a way to have some sort of independent control of those two elements without worrying about their phase relationship as much. But if you are brave and you want to try a bunch of different microphones or multiple amplifiers, then beyond just your polarity button, and maybe if you have an all-pass filter like an IBP or a radial phaser, beyond doing those things, you might want to do some phase alignment of your guitars and bass. And let's take a look inside Pro Tools at a bass track. So on this record, I have, see, my basses are grouped together, and let's make them large so we can really see them. And, well, that might be too large. Let's go to medium. Okay, so, and it's always tough to tell, but I like to kind of zoom way in and see if I can sort of like look at this volume envelope of the DI and the two different bass mics, and see if I can visually see a pattern and how they correlate. I don't see an obvious pattern here. You might be able to see a little bit of the attack. Yeah, you can kind of see it in the attack between the close mic and the sub. It sort of looks like, and see if we go back to the samples mode, it looks like we might have a 13 sample offset between the mic and the sub, which doesn't correlate to very much time, but it's enough to actually hear a subtle delay as a phase discrepancy. So I think I made a note for myself, like I did in drums, as to what that phase discrepancy was. So let's take a listen to, since I don't think I used much of the DI in the mix, I'm just going to mute that for now. And let's take a listen to how the bass mic and the bass sub sound on their own first. Sounds awesome. Why am I not hearing anything? Understand. Where's that bass? Where are you? There is no sound, and I have no idea why. Cool. Well, let's just talk about it then.
We need to get someone in here?
Yeah, I'm actually not sure.
Let's have someone.
Didn't we just listen to something? Oh, we never listened to that snare thing, did we?
No, we didn't.
There was, something happened at lunch and we had to reboot Pro Tools, and we actually didn't have a chance to test out the rig after we did that. So yeah, if someone wants to come down and check out what's going on, that would be cool. But I can talk about it while we're waiting to have someone investigate this stuff. Hi.
Hey,
All right.
we can try turning off the board and then.
Okay, let's try that.
This is our wonderful audio tech for this workshop. His name is Kellen. He's just a nice guy in general. He's really good at what he does.
Yeah, he is nice. I heard sound coming out of the speakers when you did that.
So while we are sitting here, while we're figuring that out.
Hey, sound!
We are done figuring that out. So while we're figuring that out, let's not do anything
Yay.
at all. Let's
Okay.
just say thank you to Kellen.
So
thank you,
yeah,
Kellen.
turn it off and turn it on again. Usually works, right? You guys watch the IT crowd?
It's a solution to the world's problems.
All right, so here's the bass mic. All right, here's the bass sub. And here's how they sound together right now. I'm going to turn up the sub track just so they're a little more balanced for our purposes here. All right, so I did notice that it looked to me as though my mic track was happening a little ahead of my sub track. The sub track is still a mic, but I just call the mic, the high mic of just the mic track. So I'm going to put that same time adjuster, the short time adjuster delay, on the mic track and see if we can slide this around to get the two things to talk together a little better. So at 22 samples of delay on the bass mic track sounds best to me, and that's what I have in my notes from working on it at home. And that one is, I think, a better example of how sample alignment works than the drum examples were. So you can really hear that change and the focus that it brings in. So let's hear this in bypass again, and then we'll turn the bypass off and listen to how it affects the sound. Yeah, for some reason, and it's true on my system as well, this time adjuster is buggy and bypass actually doesn't work. So I'm just gonna drag, instead of bypassing, I'm gonna drag this plugin out of the track. And so as you see me drag it on and off the track, you'll hear it come in and out. So let's start with it off the track. So you can hear the low end come into focus a lot when doing that phase alignment. So I think that sounds cool. Again, I don't like having the plugin on if I don't need to, so I am going to slide the bass subtrack back by 22 samples. So select a 22 sample window before the track starts in shuffle mode and press delete, and it will, if you zoom way in, you can see that it slides that subtrack backwards. So the reason why I'm using the subtrack is I had, on the mic track, I was adding delay. So the mic track is pushed, forward in time as opposed to the subtrack. So when I'm doing it manually, I'm then going to the subtrack and pulling that backwards in time. I could also go to the mic track and push it forwards in time if I wanted to. Okay, so we've done the phase alignment on the guitar, on the bass. Now let's go, I'm just gonna blow off the bass DI for now, but you would do the same thing with bass DI if you choose to use it in your mix. Actually, real quick, let me just illustrate something I was talking about earlier. This could be interesting. Let's listen to just the bass mic track. All right, now let's duplicate that track and let's call this bass low. Now I'm not gonna quite do the full roll your own crossover thing on this. I'm gonna let the bass mic track stay broadband, and then bass low, I'm going to do a little, a gentle low pass filter on it. So just kind of arbitrary frequency now, but let's listen to that. Compare that to my subtrack. Certainly not the same, but if you're not recording multiple tracks or multiple microphones on your bass cab, you can dupe the track and do some EQing and compression and whatnot independently of that. And there's other reasons to do this that I haven't got into yet, but reverb sends, for example. You don't typically want a ton of bottom end being sent into a reverb. So one reason I like to break the bass guitar into like a high-low component is I can just, if I want to have a little bit of reverb on my bass, I can just send the high component of the bass into the reverb. And the other thing, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later, is is actually, you know what? I'll get into it. I'll get into it pretty soon, but after I do this guitar phase alignment. But there's going to be some independent compression and some sidechain compression on the low side of the bass signal. So we'll get into that in a couple minutes. So I'm just going to delete this mic low thing that I made because I'm not going to use it in the mix because I have the bass subtrack. But you can do it. You can make your own bass subtrack that way. All right. Now the guitar thing, I'm going to use Aaron's guitar track. He's on the right side. And he's a little more meat and potatoes than Randall was. So that's why I'm using his track as an example. I did the AEA N22 microphone as opposed to, in contradiction to the picture that you saw yesterday, I ended up jamming it right up on the speaker grill, but then my RCA 44 and my SM57 were about a foot back from the speaker. So there's definitely, because of that spacing, there's definitely a time lag between those two microphones. So let's...
One quick request is
yeah.
not to sit like this because you're covering up your mic.
Oh, I apologize. Not always as self-aware as I could be.
No, absolutely. That's what I'm here for.
Yeah.
Help you out.
Okay, so let's refresh our memories on what the guitar sounds from the 44 and the 57 combination sound like in relation to the N22. Okay, so those are different, and the N22, the signal's getting to that before it's getting to the other mics because it's closer to the speaker. So if we try to listen, let me switch my solo mode again. If we try to listen to them together, they're going to be weird and phasey. So hopefully everybody agrees that that sounds kind of weird. Since the N22 is closer, let's throw our time adjuster plugin onto that. And you know what? I don't really like the new time adjuster. It's like too coarse. I'm using the time adjuster short, which is the old style one. So sounds like a phaser. It's kind of fun, but you can really hear how the tone and the depth of it changes as you sort of shuttle that around. Yeah, so it really comes into focus there. I'm going to do that thing where I drag it out of the track again to bypass it and let you hear it both ways. So it really makes a big difference in that case. So if I wanted to combine all those microphones, I feel like I would have to do something like that. It wouldn't even be optional. So yeah, so that's pretty much it for the phase alignment stuff. So let's, what should we do? Set up some master faders and auxes for the remaining instruments. That's I'm just going to quickly step through that. That's another nice thing to have, like I was talking about earlier in the drum setup portion. It's nice to have master control of a bunch of different bass mics together, master control of a bunch of different guitar mics together. And another reason specifically to do it with guitar is you can put some sort of compression on your master guitar bus. So as various guitar elements come in and out, if you have a bunch of guitar overdubs and maybe the first part of the song has 2 guitar tracks and then a section comes in with 3 or 4 or 5 or whatever, you're either going to have to write a ton of volume automation to balance that stuff out and keep the guitars at a relatively controlled level, or you can do a little bit of bus compression on your master guitar fader, whether that's a aux master or a master fader. And that bus compression on the guitar group will help reel it in. So as a new guitar element comes in, sort of squashes down the whole guitar bus as a whole and gives you a nice auto mix feature. And that will mean that you don't have to do as much bus compression during the mix phase if things are more under control at the pre-mix phase. And okay, so that's all I really need to say about the master fader things. Although once you do have your master fader set, this is also a good opportunity to double check that you have the headroom that you need all the time. Because sometimes you might have stuff running kind of hot inside Pro Tools, and you might not know until you set up a master fader on your guitar bus that your guitar signals are way too loud. So once you have that master fader set up, you can judge what your headroom is a little bit better. So that's nice.
Quick question to kind of start this
Yeah.
discussion off. Actually, SOS and a bunch of other people were like, "Oh yeah. All of Kurt's sound files look hot. What gain staging do you use coming in on a given input? Usually, when I'm recording that hot, I'm pushing what will allow me to have later headroom."
Yeah. Well, does this sound better? Does that sound better? I mean, it's just like a vertical zoom. I was recording this band one time, and like the bass
Sounds way better.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, so if you guys are familiar with the band Torch, they have a song called Fat Waves. It was kind of like the punchline of a joke. But this friend of ours was recording with me, and I'm getting a bass sound for him. He's like, "Hey, like, can you make my wave a little fatter?" And I was like, "What do you mean?" He's like, "Well, whenever I've like recorded before, it sounds better when the wave's like really fat." So I just zoomed and I said, does that sound better?
Guys, you heard it here first. I mean, it
Sounds better now, right?
This is the kind of stuff that you only pick up through years and years of experience.
Yeah.
And,
No. So anyway,
real inside stuff
typically,
here.
well, let's look at how it looks on the meters, because that's really the judge. And he's right. I did record it pretty hot. I have some Burl converters which sound nice, and they tend to get a little bit more euphoric as you push them a little bit harder. And depending on the converters you have and what kind of headroom you have to work with and how much level your mic preamps can comfortably output, and whether or not you like the sound of your mic preamps running a little colder or a little hotter and so forth and so on, you may record things at different levels. A lot of people will record like overhead cymbals kind of a little on the quieter side because they want more headroom from their mic preamps, and you might record guitars a little hotter. It's your own personal preference, and you need to experiment to see what works well for you given different circumstances. Internal to Pro Tools, you'll notice that I'm running these tracks quite low. Because I recorded them pretty hot, I have these guitars, for example, are at minus 18.5 decibels. So, kind of low to make sure that I have headroom in the internal mix bus. And setting up some master faders and some aux masters and things like that will help you track where your headroom's at. And you just got to experiment with how you do your gain staging to get sound that's working for you. I'm not great at mixing in the box, so this stuff is sort of arbitrary for me. If you mix exclusively in the box, I urge you to spend a lot of time experimenting with your gain staging. Okay, any more questions or move on?
Great.
All right, so I'm just going to check. Let's go back to the slides for a second here. And so yes, like I said, check your headroom. Once you've done all this phase alignment stuff, the tones are going to be different. You want to sort of level set your mix again. So as I said before, this is mixing is a very iterative process. You're not just doing one compartmentalized thing, then doing another compartmentalized thing. You're constantly going back and checking where you are in context, how your different elements relate to one another sonically, and how that serves the song. So level set it again, take a listen to the song, kind of soak up the vibe and see where you're going, and listen for the technical stuff, but also listen for the feeling the song is trying to evoke, and try to make your technical decisions based upon those feelings. Okay, so bass treatment. Let's go back to the bass guitar. And I touched on this earlier, but I want to talk about some of the independent treatment of the bass microphone and the bass sub. Now, the bass microphone, when it's a heavily distorted signal like this, I won't typically do any processing on that at the premix phase, aside from sending this to some sort of a reverb. And using that sparingly. I will, however, particularly with someone like Kenny who's playing sort of all over the fretboard, he's got some high stuff and he's got some low stuff, I want to maintain some sort of continual bottom end. So I will process the sub mic. If the sub mic has not already been EQ'd, I might do some EQ to exaggerate the bottom end on it. I believe that it is sounding okay at this point. All right, so good amount of sub coming off that, not too much treble. I could low pass it some more if I wanted to, but I'm not going to bother with that right now. But what I am going to do, actually, you know what? I am going to bother with that right now, and I'll get to that in a second. The first thing I'm going to do with this is I'm going to start thinking about not just the bass tone, but the bottom end as a whole. So as I said earlier, I feel like in any mix, you don't want your low end to come from too many sources. Obviously, the bass drum has a lot of bottom end, and the bass guitar has a lot of bottom end. You don't need to have a lot of bottom end from your vocals or your overheads or your guitar if the bass drum and the bass guitar have a lot of bottom end. But because the bass guitar and the bass drum are sharing space in that bottom end, you want to make sure that those two things work together. And there's a lot of things you can do to make the bass guitar and the bass drum work together. Some people just choose to high pass the bass guitar at like 80 hertz and then let the bass drum take care of all the bottom end. Some people choose to do the other thing, let the bass guitar handle all the bottom end and high pass the bass drum and just make the bass drum a bang and not a deep thud. Other people will set up some sort of master fader, aux master, or bus master on a console or whatever to combine the bass drum and the bass guitar signal on a shared fader and then compress that fader as a group. So you have bass drum and bass guitar group compression. So as the bass drum comes in, the bass guitar will essentially duck out of the way to make space for the bass drum. I'm going to do that a little bit differently. My favorite technique for that recently has been a side-chained compressor on the bass guitar keyed off of the bass drum. So, and the way in which I handle that is I'm going to go up to the bass drum. I'm going to take the kick turbo track because that's the shortest track, just the attack. I don't care about the tone of the side chain signal that I'm going to send to the bass guitar. I just care about where it happens in time. So now I'm going to, let's just give it some arbitrary bus. Bus 12 isn't used, so I'm going to use bus 12. Set pre-fader. I'll click on the fader just to return it to 0. So now I'm sending from the kick turbo mic out bus 12 at 0 decibels, and it's pre-fader send. Okay, now let's go down to the bass subtrack, and on the first insert of the bass subtrack, I'm going to put a dynamic plug-in, which will be, let's just use the stock Digi dynamic plug-in. Okay, so let's bypass this thing for a second and listen to our bass guitar sub-track again. Okay, now on this particular compressor, and not all compressors have this feature, which is one of the reasons why I chose the Digi one. I'm going to make my key input bus 12. And now in the side chain, I'm going to select key input. And I'm also going to hit the little speaker button, which lets us monitor the key input. So now I still have the bass subtrack soloed, but I'm monitoring the key input. And, oh, it's bypassed. Okay. So bass drum signal is feeding into the side chain. So all compressors have what's called a detector path and an audio path. So essentially, if you want to just think about it in simple terms, when audio comes into a compressor, it's split into two paths. There's a path which is the audio, which will be processed by the compressor, and then there's another path which is audio that tells the compressor what to do, and that's the detector path. So whenever you hear something about a side chain, that is a way to have access to the detector side of the compressor. There's a lot of tricks you can do with that. You can EQ the detector path in your side chain. You can key it from an external source like a bass drum. You can even make your own tremolo effect. For example, if you have a click track, you can feed the click track into the side chain of a compressor and make a guitar have a tremolo sound by feeding the click into it. A lot of stuff you can do. What I'm going to use right now is a ducker effect. So I have the bass drum feeding into the compressor on the bass subtrack. And let's stop listening to the side chain. And now let's start, I'm going to do it kind of heavy-handed at first, but let's start compressing the bass guitar sub off of the bass drum. It's going to sound kind of weird on its own, but when you put it in the context of a mix, it'll cause the sub portion of the bass to get out of the way of the bass drum every time the bass hits. So it's pretty heavy-handed and kind of clicky right now. It's sort of the nature of that. The clicks you actually won't notice if you bring the bass drum in. You'll actually hear those clicks actually might add a little bit of attack to the bass drum, so it could be beneficial. But now I said earlier that I wasn't going to use any EQ on this track, but I think I'm actually going to bring in some EQ now just because of those clicks. I don't really need any high end on this sub track, and the clicks are happening in the high frequencies. So let's just low pass this thing and get rid of those clicks. So with both of these things bypassed, so it sounds mangled and fluttery, but let's hear that in combination with the bass drum and the bass mic. So you don't really discern it as being fluttery once you start putting it in context. And the reason to do this is now your bottom end is going to be a little bit more steady, and it will not tax any stereo bus processing you do at the end of your mix, or any of the stereo bus processing done at the mastering phase nearly as much. Those compressors won't be working as harder, so they will sound more transparent. Additionally, you may choose to put an additional compressor after this EQ, and let's do that. What do we have? CT5. I'll throw that on there. This one is not for ducking purposes. This one is now for controlling the range of the bass guitar based on where it's playing on the neck. And this compressor also has a blend control, so we can kind of wet dry it a little bit if we want. All right, so hopefully that will sound huge in the context of the mix. All right, let's go back to the slides here, the keynote. And what do we have next? Now we're going to talk about some guitar treatment. And we touched on this, some of these concepts a little bit earlier, I think yesterday. And let's go into some more detail about them now. I'm going to go back. I'm actually going to drop the volume down on the RCA 44 and the SM57 since I didn't use those in the final mix for this song. And let's just listen to the N22 again. Okay, so that's sounding pretty cool, but let's do a couple little EQ things. I don't think that I actually needed a ton of EQ on these things in the mix, but I'm just going to demonstrate a couple of principles that you can use in Pro Tools, yeah. So one is a high-pass filter, and let's do kind of a steep high-pass filter this time, and see where do we start like losing information that we like, and so we can lose a ton of this low-end information, rumble and stuff that's not really contributing to the tone of the guitar, that's just kind of getting in the way and muddying up the overall bottom end. So let's find out where that spot is. It's important to do this on monitors that you're comfortable with, and that have a reasonable amount of low frequency extension. Otherwise, you can't really make good decisions about this kind of stuff. I'm not familiar with these monitors, so I can't make a great decision right now. But typically, somewhere around 100 hertz might be a place that I would high pass a guitar. If it's more of like a rock song like this is, you might go a little higher. If it's a metal song, you might go a little lower. It really just depends on how you want the guitar to interact with the bass guitar and the drum set. So let's do a little bit of, let's say around 100-ish. Leave that there. And then let's say you have a super sizzly guitar tone. In fact, you know what? I'm going to go to Randall's guitar for a second, which is the left side, and move the EQ over there. Because his tone, he was playing out of the same cabinet with the same microphones and the same guitar, but we used a different head with him, and I think his head was a little sizzlier. Well, that's some lead stuff. Let me get to some meat and potatoes. Cool, so let's find out where that guitar is really sizzly. It usually is somewhere around 11K with guitar, sometimes a little lower, sometimes a little higher. But we can do a little cut. Now that we've boosted at that frequency to find where the sizzle is, we can then cut at the same frequency to remove some of it. So it's a subtle thing, and it's actually not super important with this particular guitar sound, but if I was recording out of, say, like a dual rectifier or something like that, it would have a whole lot more sizzle, and it would be pretty crucial if I was, for this song, to get the sizzly component of the guitar out of the way of the cymbals. Yeah, okay, one other thing about EQing guitar and EQing bass is something I like to do to give them their own space is dial in one instrument or the other first, and if I find that I'm cutting bass at a certain frequency, I might try boosting guitar at the same frequency. Or if I'm boosting bass in one spot, I'll try cutting guitar in that spot. So rather than like building up a whole bunch of one frequency in those two instruments, give them their own space by doing opposite cutting and boosting between the two, and then you can mix both of them lower and they'll still have their own space. I don't really have any audio examples of that prepared, but that's something I like to do. Okay, I already mentioned bus compressing the guitars, and I think actually I don't have any guitar overdubs in this song, so it's not a great example, but I do like to set up bus compression on the guitars if there's guitar overdubs, just as a way to auto mix them. And sometimes I can also do a little bit of reverb on each guitar if there's not already room tracks to give it a sense of realism, or if you want that sort of guitars in a well kind of sound for some reason. Actually, you know what? This is a good opportunity to pull out another one of my convolutions. So that lead part that Randall's playing, it's pretty stylized. And it's pretty trashy. Let's try adding a little bit of one of my spring reverbs in there. So I'm gonna make a mono. Let's make a stereo. Let's make it mono. Aux input, and assign the output of that to raw tracks, and assign the input to, say, bus 15, and then let's send some of this guitar out, bus 15, and just for now, let's make it a pre-fader send so that I can solo just the reverb. And let's call that get verb. And let's put our trusty Hoffa reverb on there. And I'm going to use the one that converts an incoming mono signal to a stereo output. This way, I only need a mono send into the reverb to get a stereo output. And let me load up my, where did you go? On the desktop, I have my Creative Live course and reverb impulses. And I've got 3 different spring reverbs here. There's the Furman, the PV, and the Roland. And the Roland's probably my favorite, although they're both pretty cool. So let's take a listen to what sending some guitar to that sounds like. That's super loud. What? What am I doing? I'm doing something wrong. Pre-fader? Oh yeah. Well, no, the aux send should still affect the level. Yeah, there we go. So that's pretty trashy, mangled sounding spring reverb. Actually, I feel like that's a little long. Let's try one of the other. Let's try one of my other springs. Let's try the Furman. Still might be kind of long. Maybe the PV's better, or maybe we don't want to use this at all. I don't know. It's a little more subtle, a little brighter. I might end up using that. It's kind of trashy, and I kind of like that. So yeah, that's using one of my spring reverb convolution reverbs. Spring reverb convolution reverbs. All right, yeah, guitar treatment. Let's move on to vocal treatment. I think we spent enough time with guitar. Get down to vocal world. So we don't have a ton of vocal tracks on this one. Actually, should we field any guitar questions before doing the vocal stuff, if there's any? Or should I move on to vocals?
I think let's keep going for now.
Okay.
And we can get questions at the end just in case. Just want to make sure we get everything that we've got covered.
Yes. Okay. Vocal treatment. It's pretty much just one vocal track. There's 2 small sections with a double that are kind of quiet, and then there's the guitar player Randall did sort of a talky vocal track along with the lead vocal track, but really it's just focus on one lead vocal. So let's just talk about the lead vocal to start with. Oops, I'm gonna ungroup my vocals, and let's just listen to Dave yell at us.
One on the line! This one's a keeper! Keep digging holes! Deeper and deeper you'll find me! In cradle times and weddings!
So it's pretty much a finished vocal sound. It's already kind of overdriven. I did that with that tube compressor on the way in, and I did some high passing on the way in. So it doesn't really need a whole lot, but I did hear a passage that has some pretty aggressive S's.
In cradle times and weddings and funerals!
So you might want to do some de-essing there. My favorite de-esser is the Massey one. Let's see if we have that. Oh yeah, we do. This one's cool. Let's go into band split mode, and then so there's an auto monitor mode. So as I adjust the frequency on that thing, I'll hear just the stuff that it's going to be filtering out. Actually, let me crank up my reduction. So I'm kind of dialing in which frequency I want the crossover to be for where it's de-essing. So if you don't know what a de-esser is, it's essentially a frequency-dependent compressor. Some of them, you can make your own de-esser by EQing the side chain of a regular compressor in the detector path, where you put some pre-emphasis on the sibilant frequencies, the S's and stuff. And then traditionally a de-esser will compress the entire signal, but keyed off of the sibilant emphasized signal in the detector path. Now, one of the reasons why I like this particular de-esser is it actually has a crossover built into it. So it will leave the low frequency stuff unaffected and just compress the high frequency stuff as it sees S's. You do have to be really careful when de-essing a signal, because if you de-ess too much, you might end up making somebody sound like they have a lisp. And I also recommend doing de-essing before you do other compression or any kind of additional overdrive effect, because the additional compression and overdrive will just sort of compound whatever S's you have and then give you less dynamic range to adjust that stuff. So do your sort of forensic audio type work first early in the chain, and then do more of your tone shaping later in the chain. I had one instance actually where I was mixing a band from Russia, and they were singing in Russian, and I don't speak any Russian, and the vocals were really super sibilant, and I did a bunch of de-essing, and then the band came back to me immediately like, hey, you can't do that. Like, we have a very sibilant language, and it's important to have all of those S's in there. So, know the song and know your band, and make sure that what you're doing with de-essing is not too heavy-handed. So yeah, let's do a little bit more with this. And the other nice thing about this de-esser is it gives you a wet-dry blend. So you can be kind of heavy-handed and then back off on it. And I'm going to loop this section.
In cradle times of weddings and funerals. In cradle times of weddings and funerals. In cradle times of weddings and funerals. In cradle times of weddings and funerals.
All right, so that does a nice job of controlling the S's. What else do we want to do with vocals? Some people like very dry vocal production. Other people like very wet vocal production. I like to sort of get a feel for what the band wants before I get started, but also I like to set up a bunch of stuff sort of in the beginning and use very little of it. I find that like a wet vocal works better when you have a bunch of very small effects. So let's try a few different vocal effects. We can do some slap back. Actually, let me see what I have to work with for plugs here. A new track and a new mono aux input. And what do we have for delay plugins? Massey TD5 is pretty cool. I know you like that one, right? But let's just use the standard slap delay that Digi provides. And we'll do an aux send bus 16 into bus 16. And then our aux track with the delay is going to go out raw tracks. So let's call this Vox slap. Okay, so let's just bring this up to 0, and then we'll just solo both of them and check it out. So that's a little wild, a little heavy-handed sounding. So let's shrink down the delay. We want to keep the mix at 100% because we're doing this as an aux. If we did this as an insert, we would back down to maybe 20 or 30%. I like doing it as an aux because now I can have one instance of that plugin, and if I want to send the other 3 vocal tracks I have into that, I can do that as well without requiring additional instances of the plugin. One of the other reasons why this feels a little heavy-handed is because there's no low-pass filter on it. I'm going to start to bring in some low-pass filter, which will kind of simulate the warmth added by a tape delay.
In cradle times of weddings and funerals. 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 In cradle times of weddings and funerals.
All right, so that's just a real subtle effect, but it gives a little bit more sense of space to the song. Now, I want to do another type of delay as well. In fact, you know what? I'm just going to reappropriate this channel so that I don't have to set up another delay. And that delay will be a longer type of delay. So let's do this long delay plugin, and let's not low pass it quite as much. And this time I want to MIDI sync the delay. So this will put it in tempo with the song if our song was recorded to a click, or we know what the tempo was. And I think the song was not recorded to a click and we do not know what the tempo is, so let me show you how to tap that out. Let's see how we do. how's this transport set? Let's go to expanded transport. All right, maybe I'll view the transport. Where's my window? Yeah, transport, there we go. So let's turn this thing off. And I think that we can tap tempo.
In crowded times of weddings and funerals, I'm drinking wine.
All right, so it looks like the song's about 113 BPM. So let's turn our conductor back on, and I'm just going to close this transport thing. Go back to the top and make the tempo of the song 113. So now if I do any time-based effects, I can sync them up to the approximate tempo of the song. So now when I turn MIDI on, it should be 113, it'll follow that tempo. And if your song has tempo changes and you make a tempo map, let's say that the chorus goes up a couple of BPM, the verse goes down, or maybe there's a dramatic tempo change at some point in the song, your effects settings will follow the tempo map. So I'm going to do, let's say, looks like I don't have enough resolution to do half note. But let me switch over to extra long delay. Yeah. So now I have enough resolution to do half note, and let's see what the vocals sound like then.
One on the line. This one's a keeper. Keep digging holes.
All right, let's hear it as quarter note.
One on the line. This one's a keeper. Keep digging holes.
So this isn't really appropriate for this song, but if I were to use that effect in something else, it might be great. If I were to use it in this song, I would probably automate the send. So let's see. Over here, he says.
This one's a keeper. Keep digging holes. Deeper.
Let's just say we want to only hear it on the word deeper. We'd go in here and then sort of turn down that thing, turn down the send into the delay so it only would give us that delay sound on that one word.
Deeper, you'll find me.
Okay, so it becomes a little more subtle that way, and we have some extra control of that stuff. So we'll also do some reverb and maybe some chorus on the vocals, and just real subtly, and the cumulative effect of all those effects will give you the amount of wetness that you like on the vocal. And that's pretty much the end of the pre-mix stage of my mix. At this point, I'd have kind of everything set up, my best guess of what gear I'm using and the palette of sounds that I'm going to choose for my full mix treatment. And then I'm going to start breaking it out onto the console, bringing it up on the faders on my console, and I'll start at that point either bringing in additional plugins or patching in hardware inserts to shape the character of the full mix.
So one thing I was wondering about, you touched on it a little bit yesterday. You haven't brought up reamping again. Is that something you do very often, or is that part of your don't put off decisions ethos? Or
yeah, I'm not a big reamp guy. Like I mentioned yesterday, I try to avoid it because I feel as though an amplifier and a guitar player or a bass player have a intimate connection with one another, just like a drummer has an intimate connection with their drum set. You know, they know how to coax certain sounds out of a drum set by hitting it in certain ways, and the same is true with the guitar amp. You know, and there's like a feedback loop happening. I don't mean like noisy feedback, I mean like a intuitive feedback happening. And as you hear certain sounds coming out of your guitar amp, you start playing differently. You dig in harder, you bend harder, you shake your guitar around, you do, whatever. You're compensating for, like if there's not a ton of clarity coming off the amp, you might dig in and pick a little bit harder. If it's too clear, you might start moving your pick up the fret, up closer to the fretboard so you can have a more warm, open sound. And I think that this stuff happens kind of subconsciously with most proficient guitar players. And then to set out with the idea that you're going to reamp the tone means that the guitar player no longer has that sense of interaction with what is the final guitar sound. Now that being said, there's a lot of very practical reasons to do reamping. If you're recording in your bedroom, for budgetary constraints or something like that, you're going to go into a studio later and reamp. Cool, I totally get that. If you are sort of just starting out, you're not super confident, or even if you're not just starting out. I mean, sometimes I'm not confident with a tone. Sometimes somebody comes into my studio and they have their own rig that they're super married to, and they're like, I really love this guitar tone, and I hear it and I don't get it. I won't necessarily strike it down, but I'll say like, okay, just as a safety, let's do a reamp, and then maybe later I do try to reamp it through something else, and sometimes it does save the session. But for me, it's not my first choice of things to do. It's done as a safety. Like if I'm mixing somebody else's recording, I like them to do reamps or DIs in case I need to reamp, but I don't set out to reamp it. Especially if I'm mixing remotely, I feel like it's not my artistic decision to, put my stamp on a record. That kind of stuff should be done by the band. So I do try to avoid it. And the other thing that I mentioned about reamping yesterday was it gives you a nice visual representation of where the pick attacks are on a guitar. So if you're in a situation where you feel like you need to do a bunch of editing to the guitar performance, even if you don't use the DI or a reamp in your mix, sometimes that is a nice guide for where to do your various edits. But again, I don't do it very often, and I try to avoid it.
Another question about guitar mixing is when you were talking about EQing, you did a high pass and then a notch EQ on the high end. So a few people were wondering, kind of, is that your general approach to a notch rather than a low pass, or is that just in this particular case?
Because I feel like there's a lot of, even though our range of hearing is supposedly only up to about, as adults, maybe 15 or 16 kilohertz, there's still a bunch of sort of unheard stuff up in the super high range that adds a sense of three-dimensionality to a guitar tone. And if you do strictly a low pass filter, I find that sometimes it feels like more of a canned tone, becomes more of like a pod or like a 16-bit type of sound where there's not the same openness and three-dimensionality to the tone. So I try to do that sizzle reduction with a notch filter or a narrow bandwidth band filter or bell filter or bell EQ rather than a low pass. But it's not wrong to do it with a low pass if that's what works for you.
Great. I think we've got time for one more question. So, Black Freighter, do you ever sidechain the snare to the guitar bus compressor?
I haven't done that. It could be cool. Guitars are usually a little more prominent in the mix than bass, so it probably is not as necessary. The other thing is that my rhythm guitars are typically hard panned, so I'm going to talk a lot about this actually in the next segment, is using panning space to carve out space for instruments in addition to using EQ to carve out space for instruments. So where you can almost think about the sides as a totally different space than the center. I'd be more likely to sidechain a really bright bass mic from the snare than I would be guitar, because if you imagine like the guitar is constantly ducking down over here when something's hitting here. If you had like two drummers and their drum sets were hard panned, then maybe. But one thing that I will do that I didn't talk about as far as sidechaining goes is occasionally I'll sidechain the compressor on the guitars off the vocal, or sometimes sometimes maybe the room mics that are on the guitar I'll compress on a sidechain off of the vocal so that the guitar ducks out of the way of the vocal a little bit. But I don't do that very often.
Love it. All right, so we are going to take our final afternoon break of the day, another 15 minutes. What are we doing when we come back?
We're going to do all of the rest of the mixing stuff, and it should be pretty jam-packed. There's a whole bunch of stuff regarding how I treat all the individual instruments, but mostly I'm going to talk about running through mix revisions with the band once you've established a vibe, how to be comfortable establishing your mix vibe, and how to prepare a band to know what to expect from you, and then later to know what to expect from a mastering engineer. I have a ton of examples of the mixing process of this song that I'm going to play from the very first rough mix I did, cycling through the various revisions I went through with the band. I think there's 5 revisions of the mix, and then Brad Boatwright of Audio Siege mastered this song for us, and there were 3 revisions of the master. So we'll get to kind of toggle between raw tracks and the 5 levels of the mix and the final master, so you can hear the audio evolution of the song.
That's awesome. I love that we're able to do this and actually see that evolution as it goes through, see all those stages. It's really helpful for everyone out there.
Yeah. Actually, you know what, can I do one quick thing before we leave?
Sure, yeah, let's go ahead.
Let's do you know what? No, never mind. We'll do it next. In addition to those rough mix things, I also have stems of each instrument that are a capture of the final mix of each instrument from my studio. So you'll be able to hear all the processing I did to each instrument, as well as how they combine together into the various stages of the mixing.
Fantastic. That sounds great to do then. So along the lines of just being able to see the art in progress, I love this quote from Alan Levesque, who says, "The class you're giving is exactly what I needed to start my journey as a sound recording engineer and musician. Working on music projects was truly a dream I thought far-fetched, but clearly is not so out of reach. I love the way you explain the content. Cheers, Kurt. Thank you so much for all of your hard work."
Awesome. Well, I'm glad that people are getting something positive out of it, and yeah, really, really thankful I had a chance to be here. Hopefully, even if you hate what I do, and this gives you a list of things not to do, as long as it improves the work that you're doing, I'm really happy to contribute.
Absolutely. So thank you very much for that. If anybody else also wants to say thank you to Kurt, you can go onto our Facebook page at facebook.com/creativelive. There's a picture of Kurt there if you want to leave a comment on that, just telling, again, what it's kind of meant to you, what you've learned. We'd love to hear it. So go ahead and go again, facebook.com/creativelive. And if you are someone who is like Alan and is kind of at the start of your career, or and needs some guidance, needs to understand what you're doing, what you're getting yourself into, if you're looking to do this professionally, or if you just want to be able to really step up your own personal game to the next level, this course might be able to help you do that. Having Kurt alongside, who, again, whether you like his stuff or not, doesn't really matter. I think we all do.
You don't have to, that's fine.
You don't have to. But if you do or you don't, you can learn from him, and you can really take these things that he's learned after running his studio for so long and being able to do this professionally, see so many different types of music come through, and really just have all that experience to share and really condense into these 2 days. If you want to be able to rewatch this and see everything that he's done and put it into practice on your own time, you can do so by purchasing Anytime access to the course. That does allow you to stream or download it at any time that you like. And you can do so as often as you like from our website. So go ahead and consider purchasing Anytime access to this course. You can click the buy button directly below the video feed if that is the choice you make. And you can do so while we